I want to introduce myself. My name is Josh Danziger. I'm a junior at the Emory Wiener School in Houston, Texas, and I'm honored to have been asked to facilitate this moderated discussion here today. So let's get started. We are honored this afternoon to be joined by the second gentleman of the United States, Mr. Douglas Emhoff.
That's it?
As all of us proudly know,
I never know if there's going to be more.
As we proudly know, Mr. Emhoff is the first Jew to serve as a spouse to the president or vice president, and is, of course, married to the first female vice president, Ms. Kamala Harris. The second gentleman has recently taken on a leadership role for the Biden administration in addressing anti-Semitism in our country. He recently returned from a trip to Poland and Germany, where he visited museums at Auschwitz-Birkenau, he spoke to Holocaust survivors, and he visited his ancestral hometown, Gorlice? How do you pronounce it?
Close.
Close, okay. He was joined on this trip by the U.S. Special Envoy to Monitor and Combat Anti-Semitism, Ms. Deborah Lipstadt, who has joined us here at International Convention before and will be joining us here tomorrow. The second gentleman will be spending several hours with us this afternoon and evening. As this is his first session here today, I want to give a little bit of background into what we're doing here at International Convention. Every year, BBYO invites Jewish teens from around the world to gather for International Convention, which begins on Thursday and ends on President's Day. This event is currently the Jewish community's largest pluralistic annual conference in the United States, with as many as 3,300 Jewish teens joining us here from all across the world. These teens play leadership roles in BBYO's AZA and BBG chapters. Over the course of our time together, we have the opportunity to interact with scholars, religious leaders, and various public officials. We will also celebrate Shabbat together, partake in community service projects, do some tikkun olam, and engage in our own democratic process. But most of all, we have a lot of fun. So what's really stuck out to me, and is why I come every year, is this is really an environment where I feel safe to speak about what I'm passionate about, and it's a space where I'm heard. So I appreciate it that I'm able to be here with you and with all of you here today. During his travels, the second gentleman has been hosting roundtables with various audiences to discuss anti-Semitism. This afternoon will be one of these opportunities, an opportunity to hear directly from teens, all of us sitting here today, as to what we are facing and how we think it could potentially be solved. We will engage in an informal dialogue with the second gentleman about the administration's approach and how we as teens might be helpful in helping solve this issue. I also want to mention that we are joined here today by Ms. Maggie Siddiqui, who is the director of the U.S. Department of Education's Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. Ms. Siddiqui has recently joined the Department of Education, having dedicated her career to coalition and community building in faith-based communities. Before we begin the dialogue, I want to invite Mr. Emhoff to give some opening remarks, and then I'll ask Ms. Siddiqui to do the same.
Great. Josh, thank you so much for that introduction. I think the future is safe with
Hope so.
Our Josh's parents here.
Yeah, they are. They're there.
My mom and dad. I could tell you're the one filming everything, but no, but this is great. And Josh, you said it, having an open, safe space to be able to talk, but also to be openly Jewish and to be proud of being Jewish. And that's really one of the messages that I have been talking about not only here, but all across the world, which is I love being Jewish. I'm proud to be Jewish, and I want to make sure that everyone can live openly and proudly and without fear. And I know there's a lot of fear out there right now, and we're going to hear from you all about what your experiences are. But I've traveled throughout the country. I've met with college students all over the country. And there is a lot of fear out there right now, but I think there's also a lot of hope. And part of the work that I've been doing is to educate, to explain who Jews are, explain what the Holocaust was, but it's really also to just listen and make sure that we have a plan going forward, and that's what I'm so honored to be working on on behalf of the Biden-Harris administration is one of the things that we're doing is standing up interagency group, all aspects of the federal government. About a week ago, we had one of our first meetings. I think there were 60 people in the room. I came back from Europe. I met with leaders there, made a report. So we're going to incorporate all of that into a plan. But, you know, plans are one thing, but we also need to communicate, and we also need to make sure that when we see anti-Semitism, when we hear anti-Semitism, especially now when we hear it from alleged political leaders, we hear it from people you may have thought were heroes. We hear it from people with massive platforms. And some of what they say is just outrageous and horrible. Some of it is, as the parents here know, is based on the tropes that have been going on for millennia. And so one of the things that I want to do, that the president wants to do, will do, my wife, the vice president, is like, we got to call it out each and every time, and not just let it become normalized, and not just say, oh, that's just so-and-so talking. It's not that big. It's all a big deal. It's a big deal when in my hometown of Los Angeles, when there's banners hanging over the freeway half a mile from where our home is. It's when you see swastikas in schools, and when you all see what you see on social media, we've got to call it out each and every time. And there's also has to be consequences. Let's be honest. We need to make sure that there are consequences for anti-Semitism, for hate speech, and making sure that you're not going to be able to get away with doing that. And I also want to say that Maggie works a lot with interfaith, as do I. Hate against one community is a hate against all communities. And what, you know, Deborah Lipstadt has taught me, and it's been great spending all this time with her because I have a personal, you know, professor, expert, mentor. Because being Jewish, you know, you feel anti-Semitism, but to hear what she says, how there's a chilling interconnection between hate. And it's usually, you know, all based on the same thing. And if you look what happened in Buffalo, the screeds that this person who justice was served with the sentence was anti-Semitic tropes, taking the violence out on black people who were just shopping on a weekend. So you see it's all interconnected. And that's why we have to build coalitions. This, my wife, the vice president, says this all the time. And she's pushing me to continue to do this work, as is the president. And now I'll start my remarks. No, but seriously, I'm so honored to be here. I wish I came here when I was a young Jewish teenager growing up in Old Bridge, New Jersey. I understand there's someone from Old Bridge here somewhere. East Brunswick, everyone's from Jersey. But to think of that kid from Temple Shalom, you know, growing up, playing sports, and not having to think about all the things you all have to think about today, and to be before you as the first, second gentleman, the first Jewish person in this role is very humbling. I'm honored to be here, and I really look forward to this conversation. So thank you so much. Maggie, you gonna say a
Ms.
few words?
Siddiqui, would you like to?
Sure. Thank you so much, Josh. Thank you, everyone, for having me here today. It is truly an honor to be here with you and to be alongside the first ever second gentleman as well. And as he said, you know, first ever Jewish spouse of a president or vice president. By way of background, this is my first time in government. I was appointed in May of last year. I'm trained as a Muslim chaplain. I have spent a lot of my career focused on interfaith coalition building. I am by way of example, a fellow of the Muslim Leadership Initiative of the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. I believe that engagement must be deep, right, for true interfaith engagement to work. And so have spent my time in that and Now I'm leading as Josh said, the Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships at the U.S. Department of Education, which is one of about a dozen such centers across the administration that we all work in partnership. Our mission is to connect the work of our agencies with faith-based and community-based nonprofits. At the Department of Education, I'm also really focused on protecting students from discrimination and hate on the basis of religion. And I'm serving as the liaison from the Department of Education to the interagency group that the second gentleman mentioned on anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and related forms of discrimination and bias, very long name, and in developing the national strategy on anti-Semitism. So I'm really more interested in hearing from you all today in terms of how we can be supportive of you. Just a couple of examples of the kind of work that we're doing that might be helpful to be aware of. So last month, our Office for Civil Rights at the Department of Education issued some guidance by way of a fact sheet about how to file civil rights complaints on the basis of shared ancestry, including Jewish ancestry. That's one way we're trying to get the word out about how folks can take action when anti-Semitic incidents do occur. And then from our center, we're doing a lot of work to support schools and communities and provide them with the tools and resources that they need to create more inclusive learning environments for all of our religiously diverse students and to implement bullying prevention programs as well.
Thank
So
you,
with
Ms.
that, I'll turn
Siddiqui.
it back.
Before we begin the dialogue, I'm going to share my personal experience with anti-Semitism, and I'm going to ask two of my peers to do the same. I was sitting in my relatively small synagogue on July 15th, 2022. I was there with my friends. We were eating lunch at a Kiddush lunch after the synagogue service, and one of the congregants barges in to announce that hostages had been taken at a synagogue in Colleyville, Texas, which is actually only 25 miles from where we sit here today. And chills went down my back for a couple reasons. The main one is that my own BBYO advisor, who's with us here today, knew the rabbi taken hostage personally. I had friends, one friend who's sitting here today as well, knew that rabbi personally. And it became evident to me in that moment that the anti-Semitism that I had heard about on the news, the rising rates of attacks and hostility, it had the capacity to affect me, my friends, my synagogue, my school, my community. And I realized I had to do something about it. So I looked at that situation in Colleyville, and what allowed Rabbi Charlie Sitchin Walker to save the lives of himself and his congregants was the training and preparation he had received beforehand. And I figured I needed to provide the same training and same preparation to my peers, my friends, to the Jewish teen leaders of my community, which is Houston. So I started an organization called the Jewish Security Alliance, where and I organized multiple training sessions with community partners, including the Holocaust Museum and the Jewish Federation of Houston. And we organized and hosted active shooter training session, countering the active threat training sessions, situational awareness training sessions. We hosted Stop the Bleed training sessions. And these sessions were attended by over 100 Jewish teen leaders from representing, I think, 8 public and private schools in Houston, representing 6 synagogues and 13 plus Jewish youth organizations. The knowledge they learned in that training doesn't only protect them, but they brought it back to protect their schools, their youth organizations, and they disseminated that knowledge to protect the whole community. So I look forward to expanding that in the future, but that's my experience with that kind of outreach. And I would now like to invite Ms. Samantha Przybysky to talk about her experience.
Hi, Mr. Emhoff. It's so nice to meet you. I'm Samantha Przybysky. I'm from Norwalk, Connecticut, and I'm a current senior at Brian McMahon High School. My experience with anti-Semitism started in late elementary school, where as part of a Christmas arts and crafts project, I was handed a cardboard tree and said, "Merry Christmas, you're gonna make a macaroni tree." And I said, "I'm Jewish, what's there for me?" And I was met with, "A Christmas tree, you can make one too." And my school felt that that was inclusive, allowing me to be a part of making a Christmas tree. So I took it upon myself in that moment to say, "Where's the scissors? I'll cut myself a Jewish star." And I took home a silver Jewish star that holiday season for my family. Since then, I've experienced smaller microaggressions of anti-Semitism throughout my school, but the moment for me where I decided that it was time for me to get more involved was in my high school, my freshman year, where I was sitting at the desk that I sit at every day in my computer lab, and right next to me, just plain as the eye could see, was a swastika. And it didn't even hit me or occur to me that it had been a swastika. I thought it might be, but I was so shocked by the moment that I took a picture of it and I went home and I said, "Mom, this was on my desk today and I'm not really sure what to do about it." And my mom, who had a very visceral reaction of, "Samantha, you were just hate crimed." And experiencing that, walking back into the building the next morning, all I was looking for was validation that I had been heard. And I went to my administration, who happened to be Jewish at the time, and I said, "This was here, and I don't know what to do." And thankfully, they removed the desk, and then nothing, radio silence. And for me, it was a moment of, where was the investigation? Where was the teaching opportunity? Something happened, and it was awful, but we don't need to turn it into some huge news outlet type discrimination scenario where my school looks bad, but we could have handled it on the inside and addressed it as an opportunity for the entire school to learn about Judaism and anti-Semitism. So I took it to the mayor. I showed up that night at a mayoral candidate and Board of Ed meeting as a representative and teen liaison for CONNECT, which stands for Congregations Organized for a New Connecticut. And I spoke to the room of candidates for both the Board of Ed and mayor's office and said, "This happened in my school today, and we need to do something about it." And I, along with the help of CONNECT, had every single candidate sign a pledge stating that if they were elected into office, they would vow to do work around anti-Semitism and bring resources to schools. And then right after that, I started the work to create training with CONNECT in my local temple around anti-bias resources, but most importantly, training for teachers in my entire district and surrounding communities. So far, we've trained almost 1,000 staff members all across my community in not only how to identify acts of hate within a classroom, but identify their own personal biases, identify microaggressions that they may not even know were acts of hate, because so many things come from just lack of knowledge and ignorance. So combating against ignorance, to be able to teach that in the areas around, we can not only prevent acts of anti-Semitism from happening in the classroom, but once they do happen, we can combat them in a way of learning rather than discipline. Thank you.
Thank you, Samantha. I now invite Riley Rosen to tell your story, please.
Hi, okay. My name's Riley, as Josh said, and I'm a 12th grade student from a selective enrollment public high school in the city of Chicago. I became passionate about fighting against anti-Semitism because this past Halloween, a fellow 12th grade student came dressed to school in a German military Nazi uniform. He was allowed to partake in my school's costume contest, and later that afternoon at the contest, he goose-stepped across the stage and ended with a Nazi salute. The administrator who organized the contest smiled and cheered him along as he walked across stage. 3 days later, the principal sent out an email to the parents saying it was not an act of anti-Semitism. Later, the principal was removed from the school. Later, the principal was removed from the school, but not the administrator who organized the contest. Eventually, the head of Chicago Public Schools got involved, and he sent out an email to the school community saying it was an act of anti-Semitism. But I didn't think that was enough. The Jewish Student Connection Club, which I am co-president of, worked with the Black Student Union to organize a sit-in. 2 weeks after the incident, I spoke at that sit-in, in which almost the entire student population of 2,000 kids attended. I spoke on how I believe the best way to prevent anti-Semitism and hate is through mandatory education, especially on the topics of anti-Semitism history and the Holocaust. The student who dressed up on Halloween did undergo an investigation, and 3 months later, he unfortunately still roams the halls of my school, facing no punishment. Thank you.
Thank you, Riley. As we begin our dialogue, I'm going to start with the first question and then, of course, give the second gentleman and Ms. Siddiqui the opportunity to answer. And then I'm going to invite my panelists to ask questions, to respond to the answers, make this a conversation where we can all learn communally. As Riley and Samantha showed us, anti-Semitism can metastasize and show itself in different ways. And after you went to Poland, you were quoted saying, "I never would have thought that this would have been my path as second gentleman, working on the safety and security for Jewish Americans and Jews around the world." that would really become my cause and mission. Why is anti-Semitism so important to you, Mr. Emhoff, today, and what is the state of anti-Semitism here in the United States?
So, first of all, thank you both for sharing those stories. I know it's hard to do that, especially with everyone here and the cameras, but it's important to not only tell those stories, but the way that you responded through action, calling out, consequence, and education, and coalition building. So it's all the things that we are actually working on. If you talk to Deborah Lipstadt, these are all the things that she is saying that we need to do to push back. A lot of it is, yes, there are some flat out racist, white supremacist people who are probably not going to listen to anything. But there are a lot of folks who, through lack of exposure to Jewish people, lack of education, just lack of knowledge, you have these micro, as you call them, microaggressions. That actually, we have a pathway through education and through better communication. Because one of the issues is we have all this information and sometimes we don't communicate it the right way. And we have to be able to reach those younger people in a way that they can digest it. And that's something that we'll work on with you on the interagency because we've got the Department of Education there. But again, I looked over at her, the first thing I thought was consequence. That's totally unacceptable, totally unacceptable. And I will share a story of when I was a young lawyer in Los Angeles, and I see one of my colleagues, Jonathan Anshell here. Hi, Jonathan. Colleagues as a lawyer from LA, not on the White House. But I remember, and I've spoken about this publicly a few times now, when I asked, have you faced anti-Semitism? Well, fortunately, I didn't have a swastika on my desk or somebody goose-stepping in my high school, but I remember as a young lawyer, being in some rooms with, say, clients or other lawyers who didn't know I was Jewish. And some of the vile that came out of their mouths in the guise of jokes or, the old tropes that we've all heard. And I didn't say anything because I just didn't know what to do. And that has stayed with me for all these years. And it is one of the reasons why I don't want to be silent now. So Josh, you asked, what am I doing? I think one of the reasons I'm doing this is because I don't want that silent. I don't ever want to be silent again. I never want anyone to think that they can't say anything. And by living openly in this position as a Jewish person and speaking out the way I'm doing, and again, doing it on an interfaith, cross-sectional basis, I think that is the way to go. But we have a lot of work to do. One of the things I realized is we used to be able to say to the rest of the world, well, you need to do this because that isn't happening here. We can no longer say that about anti-Semitism. And in fact, one of the takeaways from my trip to Europe, where I was in Poland not only to visit Auschwitz and participate in International Holocaust Remembrance Day, but we had real meetings with leaders in Europe. And there's a EU plan, there's plans for most of the member countries of the EU, and they are taking this very seriously. So we learned a lot, and we're going to incorporate that into what we're doing. And we've got to do it pretty quickly, too, because every time you turn around, somebody is sending me something that cannot be normalized, whether it's something on a podcast, a shooting. I mean, it's constant, and it requires swift and very decisive action. The other, I'm going to add to the president. He said publicly one of the reasons that he came out to run in 2020 was because of Charlottesville. And you all remember Charlottesville with the tiki torches. And what were they saying? Jews will not replace us, which this crazy replacement theory is what's driving a lot of this white supremacy and this violence. Before my trip, the president pulled me into the Oval Office. I thought I was in trouble, but I wasn't. And he wanted to talk about my trip. And he wanted to make sure that I knew how important this issue was for him. And it really started with his own father. So President Biden's father was so bothered by the, frankly, a pretty dark moment for our country, turning away people who were trying to escape the violence of the Holocaust. And that stuck with President Biden's father, and he made sure young President Biden knew that. And that stayed with him all these years. And he made sure that he visited Dachau, his kids visited, his grandkids visited. And so he just wanted me to know that I had his full support, and he's making sure that pushing me to continue to do this all over the world. I spoke at the UN last week. I'm here, and this is really just the beginning. So there's a lot to do.
Ms. Siddiqui, would you like to add anything?
I think from a personal note, this is really important to me also from a coalition building standpoint. As you said, right, the white supremacy is impacting all of us. It's impacting all of us in very different ways, but it's impacting all of us. And that's the reason why we need to be joining together in this work. What first got me involved, earlier on in my career and being involved in work against anti-Semitism was because of concerns about anti-Semitism within my community as well as many other communities. The need to build bridges, to work together to challenge bigotry, but also to make sure that we're challenging bigotry amongst ourselves. And one of the things that I find really heartening in my conversations with many different faith leaders from many different backgrounds is when I bring up bullying prevention, they talk about, please help us, not have our kids be bullied, but also how, please help our kids to not be bullies as well. And I think that is sort of the attitude that I find really inspiring in this work, and that I want to kind of continue to cultivate in this coalition building space. I am so grateful for not only the stories you shared, but just the incredible work that you all are doing to organize within your communities and not only to respond to the incidents that you face, but also to prevent further anti-Semitism. And that work of, helping educators understand anti-Semitism, understand what the experience of Jewish communities in their midst is like, understand their implicit biases. That is incredible work. That is exactly the sort of thing we're trying to cultivate at the Department of Education. Really
I'd like
grateful.
to open it up to our teens to potentially ask a question.
Well, don't be shy now. Okay, Jacob. Josh.
So I'm Josh. I'm the Vice President of Judaic Enrichment and Community Service here for BBYO, and part of my role is to steward our BBYO Rise Up, which is BBYO's initiative to combating anti-Semitism and hate. So I get on bi-weekly calls with some leaders and monthly calls with a committee this year of over, I believe, around 80 teens. And there's just a lot that we try to do to educate ourselves to be able to educate others. So my question to you is how, we as teen Jews, how can we help combat anti-Semitism, and what can we continue doing and add to be able to stop all forms of hate and anti-Semitism?
So, what you're all doing. One, you got to be leaders, and leaders got to lead. And I think a lot of people, when you combine all you teens coming out of several years of COVID, Zoom learning, the prior administration, frankly, and all that stuff that was going on, and just in general, I have two kids who were teens. It's a hard time of life anyway. And then when you add on having to face what I didn't, frankly, have to face at your age, it wasn't like this then. At least it wasn't where I was. And so it's a lot to take on. And so I think a lot of teens then have a tendency to just kind of withdraw and put their heads down and disengage, frankly. And I think to see, leaders in their school, leaders in their temple, leaders in the student organizations, leaders on the athletic teams, or whatever you're doing, stepping up, just by doing that is going to really help a lot of people that you don't even think that you're helping. Two, I think that this coalition concept, this is what I've heard loud and clear from the kids who are a little older who are already in college. Their ask to me is how they want to engage with the other student organizations, and sometimes there's pushback, whether it's anti-Semitism, whether it's, well, you're white, you're Jewish, everything's fine for you. What do you know about suffering? And so there's so many reasons why there are obstacles to building these coalitions, but this is where we got to push back and just say so much gets done with coalitions. And you see the civil rights movement. You see, just look at our midterms where, like, my daughter, who's 23, her mother is the vice president of the United States. We just talk about her and her world, fashion. The first time she popped up was that Dobbs decision about reproductive freedom. And she said, that is outrageous. Dad, you need to do something about this. And millions of Ella Emhoffs out there who got mobilized. And so I think these are great models for pushing back on hate, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia. And that's why the way we approach it in the administration, the way Deborah Lipstadt approaches it, the way I learned they're approaching it in the EU, it's you get yourself together, be a leader, and then you got to reach those coalitions, as Riley was talking about. And then use your modes of communication that we're not that good at my age, but use them all. Take advantage of social and all those things to bring people together. And don't be afraid. Like, we need leadership. Like, it all matters. That's the other thing I'll say. Even though you think, I'm just one person in Plano, Texas with my little crew, it matters. It matters because here you are talking to the second gentleman. It matters, right? So keep doing it. Don't be discouraged. This is what the vice president says all the time.
Hello. My name
Hello.
is Jake Tompkins. Hi. From Michigan Region number 1701. And my question comes with a little bit of a story. So a couple months ago, the synagogue that I grew up in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, while parents were dropping off their preschoolers for preschool, a man in a white van drove up yelling slurs and all kinds of obscenities to these kids and these parents. He, after the police were called, the security, he left, and he had 911 called on him. He was pulled over by a Bloomfield Hills police officer. This is all live streamed on Instagram, and he told the officer that he was on his way to another synagogue. The officer, when he obviously should have either detained, maybe made a better investigation, what he did was he fist bumped this person, and he said, "Right on," and the man went on his way. And my question is, how can we begin to attack the issue of anti-Semitism in the systems we live in, like police and local government? Thank you.
It's just another terrible story. I mean, okay, well, again, it's training. We need to make sure we are, all the things I just wrote down, you were all saying, training, preparation, best practices, disseminate knowledge. This is everything that you all just said. This is all the stuff we're saying. It's kind of this blocking and tackling approach of making sure that that information is reaching the people who are on the front lines. And then there's got to be consequence. So just like there was consequence at the school, albeit late, there has to be consequence all across the board in that particular agency, because that's just not acceptable. We cannot have our people who are sworn officers to protect and serve for the public safety, potentially letting somebody go to commit violence, and those words are violence. That's an assault. That is also an assault, even though it's with words. Those folks could be scarred, and so that's what needs to happen all across the board. And make sure that gets reported up to your electeds, your mayors, the congresspeople. That needs to get out so we can, again, there has to be consequence at the end of the day for all this.
We keep coming back to this topic of coalition building. And I look at our world, and I look at the different communities, and communities often look closed off and insular. How do we build coalitions to tackle this issue when there's so much polarization and mistrust between our communities, political parties, between different groups?
So let's find commonalities. That's what I always try to do. Whether I'm giving a political speech, whether I was in a negotiation as a lawyer, you have to find what you have in common with first before you go to the differences. The other thing too is you have to lower the temperature of how we talk to each other. You can be aggressive without aggression. And so it's like, we've got to get to that point. And so when I'm hearing from college students who can't get in with other groups, and okay, what do you have in common? And how can we help each other? And when I was in Europe, I saw a great example of this. There was a young Muslim leader named Barak who has this group called Young Muslims in Auschwitz. And what they're finding in Europe, there's just not a lot of Jews in Europe. There just aren't. There were millions. They're just not. That was one of the chilling things on my trip. That village I went to where I found out where my ancestors were from, there's not one Jew left. And this is a story throughout Europe. So what the young Muslims were finding, that the same issues that the young Jews had in those communities, which were police brutality, economic disadvantages. There were so many things that they had in common that the haters didn't care that one was Muslim and one was Jewish. They were both being, victimized equally. And with that realization meant let's bond together and let's work on this together because we have that commonality. And I think that's the way we're going to do it. We're going to lead from the administration. I'm going to continue to do interfaith events here. I'm working on one coming up. I'm going to continue to work with other coalitions. And I'm going to continue to speak about it in the sense that it's all connected. That's why we all need to work together on this.
Ms. Siddiqui, as your position is to build these coalitions, how do you overcome these obstacles?
Well, as I sort of alluded to before, interfaith work is also intra-faith work, right? And doing that work within our communities to make sure that people are willing to do that deep engagement work and make sure that people understand the importance of building solidarity across groups and that commitment to that. I really can't say it better than what the second gentleman has just said, that we need to tackle all of this together.
Thank you.
Yes.
So once again, would any of my peers?
Hi, I'm Leah. I attend a private Christian school in Memphis, Tennessee. Even in my small school bubble, I've experienced many acts of anti-Semitism towards me and my fellow Jewish classmates. I have gotten accustomed to armed guards and bulletproof glass at my synagogue. I started a Jewish Student Alliance at my school. We brought in a Holocaust survivor to speak to the school following Holocaust denial, and more recently I began writing articles. But I'm about to leave my small school bubble. As a senior about to enter college, I've been prepared for the likelihood of experiencing anti-Semitism on campus. So my question is, as a country, how can we and the government prevent the normalization and eventual endemic of anti-Semitism on college campuses?
So It's really bad on college campuses right now, unfortunately, and we see all the stories. And I actually work part-time as a law professor, so I'm actually on a college campus 1 day a week. So I'm getting all the faculty emails, so I know just it's a big issue. It's a big issue all across the country. And then when you couple that with gun violence, we saw the tragedy that happened in Michigan State the other day. It could be a scary proposition. But again, it's kind of look back to the things I've been saying, and you got to start again at colleges with the administration, because I think there's a lot of things that some of these administrations are frankly letting go, which they should not be letting go. There needs to be consequence for just tolerating anti-Semitism on college campuses, for not providing a safe space, and they need to be some instances educated. Again, best practices, what they need to be doing, how they need to be doing it, how to make sure that the curriculum reflects, a knowledge of pushing back on Holocaust denialism and hate and anti-Semitism. And then it gets down to the students themselves. Like, you have the ability to interact with the students, and no matter what, you have that power. And that's what I've been pushing. I know that's what you've been pushing, is that coalition building. So kind of what I'd say, find your people at school, whether it's Hillel or whatever other organization it's going to be, and make sure you're all kind of together on this. And then there's more safety in numbers. And then I would say go out and then try to do some of the things I was saying of reaching out and working with other groups. But just like you were talking about, Riley, of pushing back, and you, Samantha, pushing back on the administration, you got to push back. And no matter what, if you see something, don't let anything slide. Report it. Make sure if the rules aren't right that you can put pressure to make sure they're right. You can get alumni involved. Alumni are an often overlooked but very powerful way to affect change at universities. If it's in a big city where there's big companies involved that might be sponsors of the athletic teams, you can make sure that they're aware of all these things. So there's a lot that you can be doing, but it really starts with your interactions with the other students. I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I would just add that, one of the things we've heard from a lot of different stakeholders, Jewish and otherwise, is the need for more integration of religion itself into sort of broader diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts on campus. And doing that will help kind of address, not only anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, but just other ways that sort of religion, or part of religious life, might not be sort of addressed on campus in the ways that it should. I wish, as the Department of Education, we could be in every college campus doing that work, working with the administration, working with the faculty, telling them, this is what anti-Semitism is like, this is what the experience of Jewish students on your campus look like, but we can't do that. But you all, right, can organize, much like the examples that Sam and Riley were giving, in terms of their schools, right? You can do that on college campuses as well, right, and provide that kind of training for the administration, the faculty, and students alike. I think that will go a really long way, so that folks kind of, right, we prevent at least those incidents of anti-Semitism, driven by, implicit bias and things that other folks don't realize. I also just want to note, because of what you said about, getting used to the armed guards at your synagogue, gearing up for college, I just want to acknowledge how horrible it is, right? That's the reality for you in your house of worship, and that's what's on your mind when you're getting ready to go and have your college experience, right? Your house of worship should be the place where you feel most safe, right? I know from personal experience as well. I go to a house of worship, I'm looking over my shoulder, right? When I go to the mosque, right? I'm worried, right? Who's going to walk in that door next? And similarly, when you go to college, right, you shouldn't have to worry, this is right? Am I under threat? Am I going to be under threat by my fellow students, right? Those should be the people who are helping you on your education journey and supporting you. And so I want to acknowledge how much you should not have to organize, how much that should not be part of your college experience, that should not be part of your experience of Jewish life. And we will do whatever we can to support you and make that as smooth and easy and not a frightening process as it can be.
Hi, my name's Ellie. I'm from Denver, Colorado. And one thing I wanted to bring up is a few years ago at my school, we had a day off of school due to inclement weather. And at 7 in the morning, I opened my phone and saw that there had been a swastika drawn in the snow right outside of my school. Pretty quickly, I was fortunate, and the school administration team had tackled it. It was taken care of. A few weeks later, there was another incident at the school. Again, off of the college campus discussion, how can we encourage administrators to combat anti-Semitism as a whole rather than issue by issue and then waiting for another issue to arise?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and that's really what's driving the plans that I saw in Europe and that we're working on at the Biden-Harris administration. So it's not just playing defense and reacting every time there's an incidence of anti-Semitism, which what it kind of feels like to the community right now, rather than just get in front of it with this education and the best practices and all the things we've talked about today, make that the everyday conversation. And so when there is anti-Semitism that gets through all the things that we're working on, we have a plan in place to deal with it. And then again, at the end of the day, there is consequence, there is accountability, and we just have to make sure that that paradigm of education, communication, best practices, some very clear, straightforward rules, and then consequence. Hopefully then, after a while, that's going to, one, change minds, because we still want to make sure people then understand who we are as Jews and who we are as other communities, and you should just not practice hate. And then if you just can't help yourself, but at least you know what, if you do something, draw the swastika or say something like that, there will be consequence. And I think whether that's a college campus, a high school, a place of work, all that, it should be the same. But on the armed guard part, and that is something that the security is something that the Biden-Harris administration, we have put tens of millions of dollars into enhanced security at houses of worship and in enforcement and in early detection, because you see in the news now how they thwarted an incident, I think in New York and one in New Jersey. This is because there's a lot of work going on, not only by the administration, but by NGOs and others. But it's not enough, sadly. We need to do more, and that's part of what the plan is making sure we have adequate funding for what you said, is making sure people are safe, not only in the houses of worship, but on the way to the houses of worship, and just going to the market, and all these things that are unfortunately right now, we want to make sure they are safe. So this is an area that the administration is very, very focused on and will continue to be.
I'd like to ask a follow-up to that. We keep coming back to swastikas drawn on desks in front of schools. What is the place of Holocaust education in the school system, and how has the Biden-Harris administration tackled that?
So what we, start with what we now know empirically, that there's a big problem in Holocaust education. And as years go by, less and less students know what it is, have an awareness of it, and then that's in the face of all this disinformation and distortion and denialism. So it's denialism, disinformation, and distortion, downplaying it. It didn't happen, oh, it's not as bad as they said, or they actually caused it. I mean, there's all these things that are out there that there's not enough truth. There's not enough real education about it. You mentioned mandatory education. We need to make sure, and then you're seeing this too in other, unfortunately, in this state and other states where, again, I'd say so-called leaders are trying to snuff out education and teaching us about history, including the Holocaust, but other subjects that, yes, are uncomfortable, but okay, we won't learn and we won't move forward as a society unless we are talking about these uncomfortable topics, which include anti-Semitism. So we need to have a big push to make sure that we are including that in the curriculum. But we also need to make sure we have the push on what is a Jew? Who are we? And make sure that people know that these tropes that have gone on for millennia, they're not true, but they're also just internally inconsistent, and they don't make any sense when you look at them as a whole. And that's what we're going to do as part of this interagency, and I'm sure the Department of Education is going to do everything they can to make, with the powers that they have, because it's only so much that we can do as a federal government. We need to make sure these local school boards, so parents out there, you see in the news how some of these school boards around the country are being hijacked by people who don't believe that we should have books and don't believe we should teach history, and we need to push back on that. And so if you want to jump into public service, that's a great way to do it.
We're coming up with a couple minutes left, but I'd like to know if you have any questions for us, so we can maybe bring in some other teens and answer some questions.
Well, who hasn't? Okay. Is there anything else you think that I can be doing with my platform as second gentleman, or the Biden-Harris administration can be doing that we're not doing, or we just haven't asked the right question or thought of something?
So personally, I think that, first off, I want to say thank you. My name is Luis Gandelman from Miami. And ever since I became a religious Jew, so by that I mean ever since I started wearing a yarmulke 24/7, except for when I sleep, I have faced anti-Semitism that I did not know existed. The first time I heard the word anti-Semitism was after, explaining to my parents or to my mom what had just happened to me in an airport, where I was praying in a corner and a man came at me and started yelling what I assume was obscenities in another language. And I don't know enough of that language to know what it was, but I know 3 words of that language, and 2 of them are curse words, and I heard both of them. So for that moment on, I knew that anti-Semitism would take a central role in my life, and I needed to do something to stop it. And I just want to say thank you, because it was really refreshing when I saw a Jewish face on national TV standing, right next to the vice president, right next to the president and the first lady. So thank you for everything your administration has done, for having such an amazing anti-Semitism envoy as Ms. Lipstadt. I don't think there's anything else this administration has not done, but something that this administration has been working on and should continue to working on is working with governments of other countries. You mentioned you took trips to Europe and Poland specifically. A lot of governments have taken proactive stances towards Holocaust education, but a lot of governments do not. Some of them take an absent stance. Some governments try to obscure their role in the Holocaust or minimize what happened. So if we could use the platform that this administration has as the leader of the most amazing and most powerful country in the world, to share with other governments the importance of fighting against anti-Semitism and how other countries can be doing that.
Thank you for sharing that. And so, again, having spent so much time with Deborah Lipstadt, who I know will be here at some point, she's just a force of nature, and her remit is actually international, but she's just working with me, too, on the domestic, because that's how she is. But I agree. But what I said earlier, though, stands is we need to do better here, because we're seeing on a variety of issues, other countries can now look at us and say, well, why are you telling us this when you're not even doing that? And you're seeing, I've been on 6 international trips, 4 by myself, 2 with the vice president. She's in Munich right now. We receive foreign leaders all the time. I meet with them all the time. They are very concerned about everything that happens here because we are the greatest country, but as we go, the rest of the world goes. And so it's so important, if we really want to solve this problem and those problems, we've got to take care of business here first. So then we can lead, with real ethical and moral force, not ambiguity.
I want to end it off with one last teen participant.
Hi.
Hello.
My name is Joelle, and I'm from Berlin, Germany.
I was just there.
Oh, very cool. So I would like to tell you about a project that we're doing in Germany. It is called Meet a Jew. And as the name says, we're going into small groups of people, and we're just telling about our Jewish life, but especially about our personal lives. Because what we've seen in Germany or around the world is that Jews are often perceived as only the people from the Holocaust or the Shoah, and when thinking of Jews, you only think of the people in black and white movies. So what we're trying to show is that Jewish life is very vivid, and especially in Germany, and that we're not as different from other people. We've seen that helped a lot to combat anti-Semitism in Germany. So what are ways you think to help the exchange between Jewish people and non-Jewish people to combat anti-Semitism?
Yeah, and I saw that firsthand in Berlin. I met a lot of the community. There's not a lot of Jews in Berlin. There were. But I got to see the temple and the museum and a lot of the monuments, and I met several Jewish people. I also met a lot of Ukrainian refugees, and I will give a shout out to the people in Berlin who have taken many in, which is great coalition building. I think you're right, the joy, and I'll preview my remarks later, but I want to have an upbeat message, because you're right, because you're pointing out what's really prevalent in Europe. There's just not a lot of Jews, so people only know Jews from the old grainy pictures, and we are a beautiful, vibrant, joyful culture, and the more we can present the positive aspects of why we all love being Jewish and why we love our community and our culture, to share that joy will go a long way. So I did pick that up in Berlin. So let's bring that back here. And again, I would say, lead with your, chest back, head up, and let's be proud of who we are.
On that note, with a little bit of Jewish pride, I'd like to thank Mr. Emhoff and Ms. Siddiqui for joining us here today.